what we're going to do for the next 30 minutes or so, because it is the 3-year anniversary, the 3-year mark since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're going to dive into all of the news surrounding the war in this present moment there at the United Nations. A lot of news on the war itself, also in the Kremlin, also in Washington, and in the capitals of Europe as well. So let's get it started. Fox News correspondent Rebecca Castor with more.
As the fighting in Ukraine enters its 4th year, European leaders are racing to Washington to have a say in how it ends. With the U.S. leading peace talks, President Trump welcomed French President Emmanuel Macron to the White House Monday.
I think we could end it within weeks if we're smart. If we're not smart, it'll keep going. And
Macron is looking to use his friendship with the president to ensure Ukraine is protected during peace negotiations. Trump shocked many world leaders last week when he called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator. But he wouldn't call Russian President Vladimir Putin the same today.
I don't use those words lightly. I think that we're going to see how it all works out. Let's see what happens.
The White House is also working on a deal to access Ukraine's rare earth minerals as compensation for the U.S. sending billions in aid. Talk of repayment led to an awkward moment between Trump and Macron.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the U.S., loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear,
if you believe that, it's okay with me.
But Macron also says Europe is ready to step up, as France and Britain discuss sending peacekeepers to Ukraine after the war.
Europe is willing to step up, to be a stronger partner, to do more in defense and security for the continent.
And today, the United Nations General Assembly voted down a U.S. resolution to end the war in Ukraine that did not mention Russia's aggression in the conflict. In Washington, Rebecca Castor, Fox News.
Rebecca, thanks so much. In the meantime, let's bring into the conversation now our friend, national security analyst and expert, and retired Marine intelligence officer, Hal Kempfer. He joins me. And Hal, before we get into our conversation, and there's a lot to get to, it's kind of head-spinning to even know where to start here. But point of personal privilege, you have almost every day for these 3 years been providing such great insight, analysis, and expertise on literally the day-to-day developments on the battlefield in this war that I can't even believe is still ongoing, the 3-year mark today since the invasion started. So Hal, let's start at the United Nations today. The United States failed to get the Assembly to approve its resolution here. Our resolution apparently had no mention of the fact that Russia was the aggressor and that they started this war. They were the main provocateur here. Are you concerned that the United States, at a world body like the UN, is ceding the moral ground when, for example, Vladimir Putin hasn't really put much on the table as far as concessions are concerned in these very nascent talks?
Andrew, it's interesting. It's not I'm concerned that in the public space, so to speak, that it does look like President Trump has aligned himself with the same talking points that Vladimir Putin's been putting out for years. It is the Russian talking points. Mike Waltz was recently interviewed, and he had a tough time trying to explain what concessions, what was different, if you will, from what the U.S. was saying now as opposed to what Putin was putting out there, and certainly to try and find any concessions that the Russians are making. So, it's not so much my concern. It's a concern that is really being said by the leaders in Europe. You know, if you listen to the incoming chancellor of Germany, it looks like, he's forming a coalition right now. His party won. It's going to be a center-right party. He had extremely strong language about the U.S., talking about Germany and Europe needs to go its own way, that they need to separate themselves from dependence with the United States. I mean, it was some of the strongest language, certainly from Germany, the strongest I've heard since World War II. And frankly, whereas he's a staunch believer in democracy and capitalism and world trade, it was just it was echoing throughout Europe. You're hearing other leaders say the same thing. You even saw that piece with President Macron, that he's feeling compelled to jump in and correct President Trump on some of these key points, about how much money Europe gave, because President Trump was saying, well, the U.S. gave $350 billion and, so much more, and dramatically understating the amount of money that Europe had put towards Ukraine, and feeling that he has to step in, even though they're friends, they have a long relationship, they have a good rapport. He was having to say this. And then you look at the European side. I saw European leaders coalescing around President Zelensky, and basically going with a, if you will, almost a European first sort of methodology there, separating themselves from the U.S. And I heard language over and over again by leaders in Europe today talking about, we're not going to listen to what Trump and Putin are saying or doing. And the fact that they're lumping Trump and Putin together like that, I just found very disturbing, certainly from a rhetorical standpoint. But it does seem to have more than just rhetoric. I'm seeing substance following that rhetoric.
Okay, but Hal, back to the UN briefly, though. Why didn't our resolution include a part that said that Russia was the aggressor in all of this? Was that some type of play to Vladimir Putin to get him to the table? Because from what I've been reading, from what I understand, Putin has not put anything forward yet, has he? I mean, President Trump said this today. Putin would accept European peacekeepers in Ukraine as part of a potential peace deal. Really? He would?
Putin hadn't said that. In fact, Putin came back and said no. Putin's been disagreeing with some of these things that President Trump has said as far as what the conversation says. It was interesting. There was a couple of resolutions. One was very clear that, yes, Russia invaded Ukraine. That's the one that the General Assembly passed. I think there were eight no's, and the U.S. was one of the 8. Very disturbing that, we're joining China and Russia and Belarus and some other countries in voting the same way on something as important as Ukraine. That certainly got the world's attention. And of course, a UN resolution doesn't really have any weight. It's more of a symbolic thing overall. But it did, the UN is saying, hey, look, Russia invaded. And, I would point out, though, that after President Trump had talked about, basically saying, blaming Ukraine or blaming President Zelensky for the invasion, that he finally did in an interview turn around and say, okay, well, yeah, Russia did invade. And but it's just the way that this is rolling out. It's causing great discomfort. It's causing great discomfort with our European allies. It's causing great discomfort with our allies across the world. We're hearing stuff coming from the Far East, where various leaders are very concerned because they're looking at the U.S. as the backstop should there be a war with China. And so countries like, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines are all unnerved. Markets are obviously very unnerved if you look at how market performance is going. So, yeah, there's a lot going on out there. And if it is a grand plan, if you will, if it is a grand negotiation scheme to lull Putin into a sense of comfort by not using terms that make him uncomfortable. And this has been talked about a lot, that they're basically, we're taking away the language that he would object to. We're trying to break down the barriers, what will bring him to the table to make some sort of a peace deal or some sort of armistice deal, or at least a ceasefire deal, if you will, with the Ukrainians. I think they need to really think about that because, the means and ends come very much to mind when you're looking at the effect this is having in Europe. I'm just seeing the Europeans coming together in ways that are really, really almost disturbing in some ways. Look, I'm a bit of a student of history, and if you look back at the causation of World War I, World War II, and wars in Europe, you look at some of the language, you look at some of this breakaway sort of thing that's going on. And there was a rather interesting study done some years out. It was kind of a futurist projection of where will Europe be, or where will the world be 20 years hence. And one of the interesting things, and it was by a very, very, very smart group that was putting this together, came out and they said a possible alignment of Germany and Turkey against, the U.S. and other countries. I'm like, wow, that's kind of a weird idea. I have to tell you, today when I was hearing some of the language, I go, I could see where a path is opening there, where Germany takes a very separate pathway to aligning with other countries, and maybe this is the trigger that moves it that direction. And Germany
Okay.
is a very powerful country. They are the most economically powerful country in Europe.
So, Hal, I guess my final question about this point we're discussing here, if that is the goal strategically, to massage the language in order to get Putin to the table here, has it borne any fruit, or will it bear any fruit? The United States seemingly is putting a lot at stake with what our policy is vis-a-vis the war, vis-a-vis our support for the Ukrainians. It seems like a lot of eggs in one basket, and Putin, as you've discussed so much here, not the most reliable narrator and actor.
That's a good way of putting it. Not the most reliable. I would think of some other terms, but I'll go with not most reliable. Yeah, and look, I will say there has been some progress. Lavrov did meet with Secretary Rubio down in Saudi Arabia. They did have a long discussion. Steve Witkoff had a long discussion with Putin himself, and about 3.5 hours, I think, or something. So that was a very, very substantive, long discussion there. So there has been certainly some movement in that direction. The Russians actually talked about essentially liquidating those frozen assets and using those towards reconstruction. Obviously, the terms of what they talked about were 20% of that reconstruction will go for Russian occupied Ukraine, while Russia still occupies Ukraine. There's some real issues with how they rolled that whole thing out, but they did make that offer, if you will, or not, I don't say offer so much, but they did bring it up as a talking point, as a negotiation point, as something that they would take a hard look at. So yes, there has been some progress. I don't want to say that this hasn't met with some level of success. Of course the big issue is will it move it that direction? Interestingly, and I don't know, and if it is, it's a very interesting way of doing this. There's a lot of discussion today that and certainly yesterday, that President Zelensky may sign or come up with some sort of agreement on that rare earths deal.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
The first one came out, and it was, certainly unacceptable. It was $500 billion for the U.S., and I think they were, President Trump was putting out that $350 billion is what Ukraine owes us, and of course, the aid that we had delivered to Ukraine was never conditioned on repayment. It was just aid to help Ukraine in its war and its fight against Russia. But aside from all the precedent stuff, if you actually look at how much is owed, might be 174 billion, and then you get into, well, how much of that was really aid that could potentially be something that they could repay, and it gets less than 80 billion. So it's a whole different thing. But it's interesting to hear that they might come up with an agreement. Now, I kind of look at this and go, this, I don't know if you want to say inverse logic, if you will, this perversity of logic, in terms of doing this thing where you lean towards Russia in order to get Ukraine to come to the table. Well, if it succeeds, I got to tell you, it's truly an interesting form of negotiation strategy. One well beyond Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. I'll tell you that much. But
so, Hal, I want to talk about.
But it is interesting.
Yeah, I want to talk about the rare earths minerals deal here, because according to Boris Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister, he says Ukraine is just days away from signing a deal to cede that control of its rare earth minerals to the United States. Is this separate and apart from the settlement talks about ending the war? How does the United States establishing and brokering a deal for access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals market, how does that bring an end to the war?
I don't think anything is separate and apart, and I've heard some say it is separate and apart. It's a completely separate deal. I go, well, nothing's a separate deal.
But what does it have to do with ending the fighting?
It has nothing to do with ending the fighting. If anything, it just puts pressure on Putin. And in that regard, having a deal like that in place, and of course, this is one of the things that came out of the deal, is like, oh, the U.S. says we'll provide certain security guarantees for Ukraine, but they were non-specified security security guarantees. It just wasn't, there was nothing in there of substance that they could point to. We weren't going to offer peacekeeping forces. We weren't talking about putting troops on the ground. It wasn't really clear what it was, and it kind of left the door open. Could the U.S. just cut off all arms aid altogether? And I would mention of all the money that's been allocated for Ukraine, there's still about $57 billion outstanding that has not been spent or used up for aiding Ukraine. So there's a lot of money literally just sitting on the table without any more allocations that can play a decisive role in that war effort. So with that, it wasn't entirely clear. If there is an agreement on the table, I think that those are issues that they're going to have to work out much more closely. That would put pressure on the Russians, so much so that Putin today was talking about that there will be a deal with the U.S. on rare earths coming from Russia. And magnanimously, he offered rare earths from Russian-occupied Ukraine. I said, well, that's really something. Okay. And but he's trying to make a deal on rare earths itself. And I just find it an absolutely fascinating dual negotiation going on here.
Sure.
With Russia offering it, Ukraine offering it, the U.S. kind of, looking at the different offers and stuff. Yeah. It's fascinating. And frankly, that may be part of the purpose of why they did that.
Yeah, I mean, it just dawned on me, it's not necessarily just Russia and Ukraine that need to negotiate via the mediator, the U.S. The U.S. also has to, offer something or bide their time with Ukraine, not just with Russia. And so that was somewhat illuminating. Thank you, Hal. I want to talk, though, about what Zelensky said over the weekend about stepping down from political power as president if more security guarantees were given to his country or, say, a promise of NATO membership. I just want to put this up here from Fox News saying, ready to resign. Zelensky said he would step down as president of Ukraine if it meant his nation would be accepted into NATO. Now, Hal, does this belie the argument that we were talking about last week that was proffered by President Trump, calling Zelensky a dictator, saying that there hasn't been elections in the country since 2019, even though the country is under martial law and it is prohibited here? Is this someone who is clinging to power, saying that he's ready to resign? And that could be still in wartime, Hal. He's ready to resign if he got more security guarantees?
Well, what's interesting is, first off, I don't think President Zelensky is clinging to power in any way, shape, or form. He was elected to office. Russia invaded. They, like any country in a situation like that, they immediately went to martial law. They've been in martial law ever since. Their country is still a big chunk of it's occupied by Russia. There's about as fierce a fighting as it's the most fierce fighting anywhere in the world. The casualties are unbelievable. And so with that, they can't hold an election. It's not like the U.S. in World War II. The U.S. in World War II, yes, we held an election, but the U.S. was not occupied by Germany or Japan in World War II. The U.S., for the most part, with the exception of some, Pacific territories, was largely intact in World War II. There was no foreign occupation. So even though we were in a war, we were able to hold an election. And of course, and then I would also bring out, of course, the U.S. also was able to do it in the Civil War. That's a different discussion. But with this, if you look at what he offered, he said, if Ukraine is given NATO membership, that would require the U.S., the Trump administration, to completely pivot 180 and agree to grant NATO membership to Ukraine. That would be an amazing accomplishment. And at that point, I think President Zelensky would do well by saying, hey, it's time to hold elections. I've been holding office for a long period of time, and to step down. The other one he said is if there's a peace agreement, and I want to just make sure I clarify, he was talking peace agreement, not a ceasefire, not a temporary ceasefire, not an armistice, so to speak. He was talking a full-on peace agreement. A full-on peace agreement would be something that Ukraine agrees to, certainly something that Russia agrees to, but I can't see a full peace agreement without the concurrence of the Europeans, because the Europeans would probably have to provide the peacekeepers. They've already talked about 30,000 peacekeepers of European troops going in there potentially. So that would be a huge hurdle. Either of those things would be major, major steps. So it's not like stepping down in the middle of the war. He would step down when this war was truly over, when the threat from Russia was
Okay.
truly aside. And at that point, I think he could take a lesson from history with Churchill. You know, at the end of World War II, Churchill did not do well politically. They said, thank you. You led the country. You kept us. And then he got voted out of office. And one of those great historical things that the U.S. said, how did that happen? And that's what happened to Churchill. He would probably say, hey, look, it is time to step aside.
Hal, let's talk about the war itself. We're talking about all these stories around the war and about the war. I want to talk about the war itself because you're hearing from a lot of these leaders and coming from the White House, coming from Europe, quite confident, very optimistic that some type of settlement or resolution is coming in the next few weeks, the next several weeks we've heard. That is a very optimistic timeline here. But I want to talk about the arguments being proffered by some who say that Ukraine has given it all they could and they can't give any more, that Russia is making advances. Yes, the casualties are staggering, but that we, Europe and the United States, have done enough, all we can, and this is the trajectory of how the war will go. Stalemate. I want to read this from Jim Garrity at National Review. He said, in the span of 1 year, Russian forces gained territory that's equivalent to somewhere between Rhode Island and Delaware, the size of those states, costing Russia 429,000 casualties within 1 year of this 3-year war. So I wanted to put that perspective out there, and that was according to some of the UK Defense Ministry figures about the losses Russia has sustained here. Would you show those figures and those casualty numbers and those statistics proffered by the UK to some who are offering this argument about being skeptical of any more U.S. support, of any more security guarantees, because the war needs to stop, to freeze in place? What would you tell them?
Well, I'd say that those are Putin talking points. What you have to look at is what's happening in Russia. Economically, they are falling apart. There's various estimates, very smart estimates that say either by the end of 2025 or sometime in 2026, the Russian economy will have just completely run out of steam and collapse. So Putin is very well aware of that. And frankly, I do believe that despite the rhetoric, President Trump has at times mentioned the fact that Russia's economy is in a very bad situation. The other thing I'd point out is, first off, and I'm a Western states guy, so when you start saying, you know, the size of Delaware and Rhode Island, I tend not to get too impressed with the size of those states. I'm sorry, it's a bias. You know, I come from California and I've lived in the West, so our states are much bigger. Those are not, that sounds like impressive territory, but it's not a huge amount of territory. And if you look at the immense losses that Russia suffered and is suffering to gain very modest amounts of territory, they are not having much success. The other thing is when they, when they've been pushing in the Donbass, they were met with what some have called a wall of drones. And that's where one of the things missed is about 70% of the casualties being inflicted, casualties both in terms of troops and with armor being inflicted on the Russians, are being inflicted really to a large degree on both sides, but specifically on the Russians, about 70% are being inflicted by drones. These are everything from FPV, first-person view drones, to larger drones. These are long-range drones, short-range drones. Drones have revolutionized the battlefield. With that metric, and this is Ukrainian production, last year they produced about 1.5 million drones. This year they're estimated to produce 4.5. This is Ukraine manufacturing 4.5 million drones. You just do the math and you go, from a defensive standpoint, Russia just can't move very much. And now surprisingly, Russia, which has always been known as the big tank, heavy armor army since World War II, Ukraine has a preponderance of tanks on the battlefield. They actually have more tanks. Russia's way back. You know, troops on the battlefield in Ukraine, Ukraine's got the advantage. Sure, they've got a lot of problems. You know, don't get me wrong. They have manpower problems. They got all sorts of issues. But nobody doubts, even if the U.S. completely pulled out and said, we're not going to help at all, Ukraine will keep fighting throughout the year. And the Russians, if they make advances, will be modest advances. But there's nothing big.
Hal, lastly and briefly, I want to ask you these two questions. What does a Ukrainian victory look like going into year 4? And what does a Ukrainian loss look like?
Well, a Ukrainian loss would be if the Russians go in there. And right now, with the situation on the ground, the only loss I can see would be really a political loss, where if the Europeans were to somehow lose their will to support the Ukrainians. But it's very difficult to see. Certainly, nothing like Putin was aiming for at the beginning of the war, where he thought he was going to sweep across Ukraine. That just does not seem to be in the cards for them anymore. So Ukraine could lose some territory. They could lose the entire Donbass, for example. And it's very possible that may be where Russia would stop and say, okay, let's sue for peace or come up with something. A Ukrainian victory, again, I don't think it'll be complete at this point. At one point, the thought was if they can get a breakthrough, like they tried in the summer of 23, if they could get a breakthrough, get well behind the Russian lines. And at that point, the Russians were in such a horrible shape that if that happened, we'd seen where Russian lines would simply collapse.
Okay.
Something like World War I, where the Russian lines collapsed, and the Russian army literally turned and marched on Moscow. That probably is not going to happen either. So I don't see a huge Ukrainian victory. It's going to be movements a little bit this way, a little bit that way, but I just don't see either side achieving their full war goals or aims.
All right. Hal Kempfer, we're going to leave it at that. You're going to continue here on Live Now, providing such great analysis into this conflict that still rages on. Thanks so much, Hal.